This is for educational use only. Our group is allowing our instructor, Mr. Roldan Ardines, to use this as an educational material.
Method of questioning, now known as
In the realm of philosophy, there exists a question that haunted the thinkers for centuries. A question that has sparked debated and ignite controversy and fuel the imagination. So, what is the nature of self?
In ancient Athens, a man named Socrates roamed the streets, seeking wisdom and questioning everything. He believed the self was just not a physical body, but the soul.
For Socrates, the soul was immortal, existing before birth and after death. But what did this mean for our understanding of identity?
Socrates' method of questioning, now known as the Socratic method, was designed to expose the contradiction and flaws in our thinking. But as we delve deeper into his philosophy, we begin to realize that the self is not as fixed as we thought.
Plato, a student of Socrates, took his mentor's idea and crafted a vast metaphysical landscape. He believed that the self was composed of three parts: reason, spirit, and appetite.
For Plato, the self was a complex, hierarchical system with reason as the highest and most divine aspects. But what happens when these parts conflicts?
Plato's theory of tripartite soul raises question about the nature of identity and the human condition. Are we merely a collection of conflict, desire, or is there something more to our existing?
Aristotle, a student of Plato, took a more empirical approach to defining the self. He believed that the self was composed of both form and matter, with the form of being the essential, defining characteristics of a person.
Aristotle's concept of the self is composed of both form, or the essential characteristics, and matter, or the physical body, shaping our understanding of personal identity and human existence.
Saint Augustine of Hippo, a 4th century philosopher and theologian, deeply influenced Western thought, especially on the concept of the self. For Augustine, the self is defined by the soul and immaterial essence that can take, reflect, and know.
Augustine believed that the soul is distinct from the body and is illuminated by God's divine light. It is through this divine illumination that the soul can understand true knowledge. Unlike other thinkers, Augustine argued that humans don't gain knowledge through sense experience alone. Instead, true understanding comes from God revealing truth to the soul. For Augustine, the self is not just a product of our experience but a soul guided by divine light, seeking truth and understanding from a higher source.
Anthony de Melo, a renowned spiritual teacher, had a profound view of the self. He believed that the self is an illusion created by our thoughts, beliefs, and attachment. According to de Melo, true freedom can only be achieved when we let go of this constructed self. For de Melo, the self isn't fixed or permanent. It's a collection of ideas and beliefs we identify with, shaped by societal influences and past experience. This illusion of self traps us, limiting our true potential. De Melo teaches that the freedom comes from being fully present. By observing our thoughts and emotions without attachment, we can experience liberation, free from the illusions we cling to. For de Melo is realizing that the self is not a permanent entity, but a product of conditioning. When we stop identifying with it, we open ourselves to a deeper, unconditioned freedom. Anthony de Melo's message is simple. The self is an illusion. Let go of it, and you'll discover true freedom, peace, and presence in the moment.
René Descartes, the famous philosopher, presented a groundbreaking view of the self. He declared that the self as a thinking entity, our soul or mind, is radically different from the physical body. In contrast, the body is a material, mortal entity. It functions like a machine, governed by a physical laws even when the mind is not active, such as when we sleep or are in coma. Descartes believes, like Plato, that the soul continues to exist beyond death, seeking union with the spiritual realm and God's eternal mind. For Descartes, the self is a duality, the thinking soul, eternal and independent, contrasted with the mortal, material body. These distinctions shape how we understand our existence in the world.
John Luke, an influential philosopher, had a distinct view of the self. For Luke, the essence of the self is rooted in its conscious awareness, our ability to think, reason, and reflect upon who we are. Luke argued that the self is defined by the continuity of consciousness. It's not about a specific body or soul, but about the ongoing awareness of ourselves as thinking, reasoning beings. This consciousness makes us who we are.
Unlike some other philosophers, Luke didn't believe that the self had to reside in a fixed substance or soul. Instead, the self could exist in any number of bodies or soul, as long as there is continuous self-awareness. For Luke, memory plays a crucial role in maintaining the identity of the self. Our ability to recall past experiences and recognize ourselves in the flow of time ensures the continuity of our identity. In the end, Luke's view of the self emphasizes the identity is not tied to a particular body or soul. It's the continuous conscious awareness of being a thinking, reasoning individual that defines us.
David Hume, an influential philosopher, had a unique perspective on the self. For Hume, the self is not a fixed and changing entity, but rather something tied to our experiences and perceptions. For Hume, if the self were a consistent, unchanging entity, any impressions that gives rise to the idea of self would have to remain the same throughout our entire lives. But the believes this isn't the case, or self isn't constant. Hume proposed that the self is more like a bundle of constantly changing impressions and ideas without any underlying permanent essence. For Hume, the self is fluid and ever-changing collections of perceptions with no fixed core. It's our experience rather than an unchanging essence that define who we are.
Immanuel Kant, a key figure in philosophy, presented a dualistic view of the self. He believed that our consciousness is formed by both an inner and outer self working together. Kant's inner self consists of our psychological state and rational intellect. It is the part of us that thinks, reflects, and makes sense of the world through our reasons. When Kant speaks of the inner self, he refers to perception, or the self-awareness we have of our thoughts and experiences. This is the ability to reflect on our own mental state. For Kant, both the inner self, our intellect and our perception, and the outer self, our senses and physical world, work together to form our consciousness and shape who we are.
Paul Churchland, a philosopher known his work Neurophilosophy, challenges traditional views of the self. He asserts that the concept of self originates in the physical brain, not in an abstract or invented mind. According to Churchland, the self is not some mystical entity, but a product of the brains. Physical processes, our thoughts, actions, and identity emerge directly from the complex activity of neurons in the brain.
For Churchland, the self is not a mysterious force or a product of non-physical mind. It's the result of the brain's physical process, shaped by evolution, and integral to our identity.
Edmund Husserl, a key figure in phenomenology, presents a complex view of the self. He described the self as the monad, the totality of one's lived experience, encompassing all aspects of our consciousness and identity. For Husserl, the monad represents the entire range of one's life experience. It's not just a fixed identity, but a dynamic unfolding totality that includes every thought, memory, and perception. Husserl argued that within this monad, we can distinguish the different levels of consciousness. At the deepest level, there are the three ecological flows times of consciousness, a state of awareness that far from our ordinary ego-driven experience of ourselves.
Merleau-Ponty, a leading figure in essential phenomenology, presents a unique view of the self. For him, the self and perception are deeply intertwined with physical body. For Merleau-Ponty, the self is not something separate from the body. It is the body itself, through which perception, action, and identity are formed and experienced. The body, then, is not just a passive object, but an active, living subject. It is through the body that we engage with the world and express our true self.
Michael Foucault, a leading figure in postmodern philosophy, introduced the concept of techniques of the self or arts of the existence for Foucault. These are practices through which individuals shape and transform themselves.
Richard Rorty, an influential philosopher in pragmatism, redefined the self as a contingent and socially constructed identity. Unlike traditional views, he rejected the idea to fix essential essence to our beings. For Rorty, the self isn't a permanent, unchanging core. Instead, it's a fluid and evolving narrative shaped by language, culture, and historical context in which we live.